All right, in our last study, if you remember, we saw Paul and we saw all the other Roman prisoners. They've left Caesarea by ship and they're headed for Rome. All right, and if you remember, Paul warned them when they were there that they should really stay where they were for the winter. And because he knew what the winter winds could do and would do, because he's been through 2 shipwrecks himself. But the captain thought if the winds change, we should press on and try to get to Phoenix, because it was a better port on Crete for them to overwinter. Well, they did leave. They did leave where they were, and they tried to get to Phoenix, but as soon as they got on the water, the winds changed again, as you remember, and they got into a terrible storm, and they were bounced about, they were pushed about by the winds for 14 days, and they really didn't have any way to control what they were doing. And the waves just, they finally, Paul even told them, he said, if you had listened to what God had told me, we could have stayed there. But since we're not, I want you to tell you what God has told me again, that we're going to be okay, but we're going to have to beach this boat, beach this ship, and that everyone will survive. And they did. They ended up stuck on a sandbar, and the waves just were destroying the ship, but all 276 men were saved. And then, many of these were prisoners, right? And instead of killing the prisoners, as Roman soldiers would have done, the centurion allowed everyone to float in or swim in to shore. And Paul had been told, if you remember, Paul had been told by an angel of God that he would stand before Caesar. So Paul knew he was going to make it, but he didn't know when that was going to be. And but here Paul is seeing God do some very vivid and dramatic things to get him there. I mean, this ship's already made it through some vicious storms, and now it was stuck on that sandbar, and here he was floating towards shore, wherever they were. And so that's where we'll start out this morning. We're going to start out in Acts 28. This is the last chapter in Acts, folks. Acts 28, verse 1. Who's got that?
When they had been brought safely through, then we found out that the island was called Malta.
Yeah, they didn't know what this island was. Maybe the ship's captain assumed it must have been Malta because they knew Malta was there. But they found out they were shipwrecked on Malta, and Malta's this very small island. If you have your maps, you can see Malta's a very small island. It's about 60 miles south of Sicily, but they drifted 500 miles from Crete, because it's 500 miles from Crete. Now, most of the inhabitants of Malta were of Phoenician origin. Now, Phoenician means they were of the eastern Mediterranean area, which is pretty much Lebanon and Syria. Okay? All right, let's read verse 2.
The natives showed us extraordinary kindness, for because of the rain that had set in and because of the cold, they kindled a fire and received us all.
Yeah, let me bring it back up. All right, Luke tells us that the natives who found them, he said, showed us extraordinary kindness. Now, the Greek here that Luke actually uses says the natives showed us a kindness that you don't often meet with. So it's a very extraordinary kindness, but the Greek actually means that you don't normally meet with. And the natives, they came out in this bad weather, because remember, it's still raining, it's still storming. They came out in this weather, and they kindled a fire for them to warm them up from being out in the cold sea. Let's think about this, okay? It's probably October, November-ish, right? That's a pretty cold time, isn't it, normally? This October, November, and the weather would have been cold, and these people had just floated from the ship, or swum from the ship, and they're wet. That water in the Mediterranean, I'm sure, was cold in November, okay? So the storm was still raining. I don't know how bad the storms were, but the winds were probably blowing, and these people were probably freezing because they just come out of the water, cold water. They're probably very cold, and they might be even suffering from hypothermia, and the local people might have seen this, and they came out to help. Okay, they kindled that fire to receive them all. And Luke calls them natives. Okay, now natives is the Greek word barbaros. And barbaros means foreigner, Yes, it means barbarian, and where we get our word barbarian, but it actually means any non-Greek person. Okay, barbaros, probably properly understood, means one whose speech is rude or harsh. Here, barbaros is used to signify someone who speaks a different or strange language other than Greek. Okay? The Greeks called anyone who spoke with another language other than Greek a barbarian. I mean, that's just what they called them. We think of barbarian as something different, but they knew that anyone that did not speak Greek was a barbarian. All right, let's go to verse 3.
But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand.
All right, first we see that Paul is among the able ones who's going out. They've been rescued, and they were doing whatever they could to assist the people here, right? Paul was out there. Luke tells us that Paul was trying to serve others by gathering firewood. All right, now this is very interesting because in the Hebrew culture, wood gathering was always done by the women and by the children. So here we see Paul doing that menial task as he's gathering the firewood. Now culturally, this is somewhat strange, but biblically, it's really not. Because Paul claimed to be a follower of Jesus, doesn't he? And he said in his letter to the Corinthians, he said, "Be imitators of me, just as I also am of Christ." And it was Jesus who had told him, Jesus told them just that. He said, let's look at what Jesus told his disciples in Mark 10. Mark 10, verses 43 through 45.
But whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant, and whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave to all. For even the Son of Man did not come to be served, but to serve, and to give his life a ransom for many.
Yeah, whoever wishes to be great among you shall be your servant. Whoever wishes to be first among you shall be slave to you. He said, I didn't come to be served, I came to serve and give my life a ransom for many. He did that. He's creator of the universe, isn't he? I mean, Jesus being the creator of the universe is in supreme position of authority. But when he came into his creation, he came to serve, not to be served. That's interesting when you think about that. And this is the same attitude that he expects us all to have. And Paul had that attitude. Because the disciples' prime concern, said Jesus, is to serve, even to be a bondservant. And that's really the true test of Christians. We don't look for praise, or we shouldn't look for praise. We will gladly do the lowest task if it will only help someone. That's the attitude I think we need to have. Christians want to be useful for God's service, and those who want to be great in Christ's kingdom will become a servant. And that was the image. That was what Christ showed us himself. Well, in the eyes of the men on the ship, Paul had established a great deal of credibility, hadn't he, with them? I mean, they all looked to him for information, and they looked to him for answers. Yet, when it comes to firewood, Paul is right out there with them collecting firewood because they needed it. I mean, they were freezing, and firewood, is going to help them a lot, right? They'd just gone through 14 days of no food, rough seas, and cold weather, and cold water. They've all been through rough times, but here we see Paul choosing to serve the others by doing just that. All right, let's read Acts 28, verse 3 again. Read that again.
Okay, I didn't know
please.
Someone else had it.
No, you.
But when Paul had gathered a bundle of sticks and laid them on the fire, a viper came out because of the heat and fastened itself on his hand.
Yeah, now we get to talk about that viper. Okay.
That's what I was thinking.
The natives knew those snakes, okay? And when they saw that viper who had fastened itself to Paul's hand, I mean, he wasn't just bit. When I got bit, I never saw the snake. He just bit me and slithered away. But the viper here is fastened to his hand, okay? And these people knew that Paul was going to be dead because everybody dies when they get bit by this snake. All right, let's read verse 4 now.
When the natives saw the creature hanging from his hand, they began saying to one another, "Undoubtedly this man is a murderer. And though he has been saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live."
All right, I want you to notice the natives' theology here, okay? You know, they interpret this event kind of like the health and wealth people do, okay? The prosperity people do. If bad things happen to you, you must have sinned. And you must have sinned for something bad to have gotten bitten by this snake, is what they're saying. This illustrates the fact that we often, just like Job's friends, we often make judgments which are not very accurate about some people's sin and about what's going on in their life. What they say is, undoubtedly this man must be a murderer. I mean, a murderer? Come on. Undoubtedly this man must be a murderer. Even though he was saved from the sea, justice has not allowed him to live.
Mine has that capitalized, justice.
Yeah, but you know why?
God,
Okay, what?
because it's God.
It is a god. Justice is the Greek word dike. And the Greek word dike refers to the goddess named Justice. This is not justice as we think he got his due diligence. This is Justice, the goddess. Justice was the daughter of Jupiter, whose office was to take vengeance or inflict punishment for crime. So that's who Justice is. They are talking about an actual one of their gods. The natives believed that because of Paul's sin, he was receiving vengeance due him. They expected him to drop dead from that snake bite any second, okay? Because everybody always did. Right, now let's read 5 and 6.
However, he shook the creature off into the fire and suffered no harm. But they were expected that he was about to swell up or suddenly fall down dead. But after they had waited a long time and had seen nothing unusual happen to him, they changed their mind and began to say that he was a god.
All right. If a poisonous snake bit you on your hand, what would you do? Have a heart attack, panic, freak, right? Just, yeah.
I was wondering if he was trying to fling it off or if he just kind of shook it like this.
I mean, I'm just seeing him. He got bit by a snake and he flicked it. Well, where did he flick it? Into the fire. Okay, he flicked it into the fire. That's important. He flicked it into the fire. The natives knew that Paul was dead. I mean, you know, everybody dies from that snake bite. And he got bit good because he was holding on, right? So they expected him to swell, it says, they expected him to swell up and die. Okay? But nothing happened. So they changed their opinion of Paul. They knew these snakes, and they knew what happened every time somebody got bit. They died. But this man didn't die. So what they think he was? He must be a god. He might be right up there with Justice. I don't know.
Like every time he gets up to go get more firewood or whatever, they're watching him.
Let's see. They
You
could
know,
get
like,
bit
because
again.
they're waiting for him to just keel over, I feel
There
like.
you go. Well, Luke probably actually wrote
It's a
this
long
incident.
time.
For us to see it, I would think is symbolic. Okay? To Christians, the snake represents whom? Satan. The snake represents Satan. And here was his representative seeking to kill Paul. And he failed. And we've seen things like this happening repeatedly in the book of Acts. We've seen a few different things where Satan's representative have gotten in charge or gotten in there, but he hasn't had any leeway against Paul. Well, first, let's reflect back on Paul's call to the ministry. Okay, we just saw this in Acts 26 when Paul recounted all of his life to King Agrippa, when he's telling everything to King Agrippa back in Acts 26. Let's read Acts 26, verse 18.
To open their eyes so that they may turn from darkness to light and from the dominion of Satan to God, that they may receive forgiveness of sins and inheritance among those who have been sanctified by faith in me.
Yeah, God called Paul from his life of persecuting Christians to minister and witness to all people, both Jew and Gentile. Okay? His instructions from God, according to what Paul told King Agrippa, was he was there to open their eyes so that they would turn from darkness and to light, and from the dominion of Satan to God. And here we see Satan's minion biting Paul and hanging on. And Paul flicks off that snake into the fire, showing us and showing the natives that the kingdom of God defeats Satan and has more power over that aspect of life. And in Scripture, I really see miracles. I see the miracles of Jesus and the miracles of the apostles as signs proving who Jesus really was and is. He's the Son of God. And he has the one who has power over everything. Let's think back, the calming of the sea. When they were in the boat, he woke up and he said, "Be still." And the sea was calmed. That proved who he was to his disciples, didn't it? Feeding of the thousands, he did it twice with just a few loaves of bread and fish. He did it twice, and he proved that he could feed those who needed it. Those miracles. Raising people from the dead showed those people that Jesus had power over life and death. And here we see Paul, who gets bitten by a very deadly snake, and nothing happens. That proves to them that there is something very special about this man, Paul. And we need to listen to him. God is using this incident to point to himself and to give Paul the opportunity to speak to these people about Christ.
Can I make a comment?
Sure.
Sometime recently, somebody was talking about a detour.
Speak up a little bit.
Somebody was talking about a detour earlier today. So I would say that this is one of those detours. He thought he was on his way to Rome, but God had some detours.
That's why God definitely had places he needed Paul. And he needed him right there, didn't he, in Malta? Yep. And he used Paul for just that reason, didn't he? Yep. And guess what? He might use us sometime. So be prepared to get a little detour in your life.
But if the snake was representative of Satan, then God took what Satan meant for evil and turned it around.
Absolutely. That sounds scriptural, doesn't
Like
it?
he always does.
It's really good. Well, well, this incident actually has caused a lot of misunderstanding in church history, hasn't it? I mean, there are still churches that practice snake handling. Unfortunately, several people get bitten from time to time, and they even die because of this snake handling. These people get their authority for this snake handling, though, from Jesus himself. So let's look at what Jesus said in Mark 16, verses 17 and 18.
These signs will accompany those who have believed. In my name they will cast out demons. They will speak with new tongues. They will pick up serpents. And if they drink any deadly poison, it will not hurt them. They will lay hands on the sick, and they will recover.
All right, now here, this is at the end of Mark. This is the last chapter of Mark, and Jesus has said, go into the world and make disciples of all nations, baptizing in the name of the Father, Son, and Holy Spirit. And then he goes into this in the book of Mark. Now, how many of y'all are believers? Okay, I see lots of hands, okay? Would you drink poison knowing it probably wasn't going to hurt you?
No.
Because God's going to protect you? No. How about picking up snakes, especially poisonous? There's a timber rattler. Let's go play with it, right? No, why?
There are people out there that like to do that.
There are, but I mean, the Bible does not teach this. Okay, they say that this says that we will not, they will pick up serpents. The Bible doesn't teach this, nor did Jesus mean that all believers will demonstrate these miraculous signs. Okay, Jesus is speaking to his disciples at this moment, and he means this for them, not for us. He means this for them, because they will be protected when the time comes. Okay, and this time for Paul is right now. He did not pick up that serpent, did he? Well, he did pick it up because it was latched onto his hand. But he's not picking up serpents. The serpent picked him up, but he is protected by God. And this incident with the snake certainly gave Paul a more attentive audience to him, didn't it? And because they want to know who this guy is and who he follows. You know? All right, let's go on back into Acts and go to Acts verse 7. Who's got that? Acts 28, verse 7.
That's me.
You got it, Roger.
You know, first though, how many people would get bit by a snake and not even say anything? They should at least said, "Snake, you're fired."
I mean, hey, I got bit by a snake and it hurt, so his didn't seem to hurt.
Yeah.
So,
Anyway, now in the neighborhood of that place were lands belonging to the leading man of the island, named Publius, who welcomed us and entertained us courteously 3 days.
All right, so the title here that Luke gives this man is the leading man of the island. Now that title was always given to the Roman governor of Malta. Okay? His name was Publius. And he entertained us he entertained and, what did it say? He entertained and welcomed us for 3 days. All right, now who is us?
The people on the ship.
Was it all of them, or was it just Paul and Luke and...
I don't know.
Well, we kind of get an idea that it's all of them, because when the natives came in, they kindled a fire and received us, all it says. So I think it probably speaks of all of them as well, because he speaks earlier in this, just a couple verses ago, about us, kindling a fire for us, and here he is entertaining us. So I believe that Publius probably found them lodging, because they're going to be there for the rest of the winter. And he probably he took care of getting them lodging, welcoming them, but he entertained them for 3 days there. So he's making sure probably they have dry clothing, and he's trying to help these people that came to their island. And he's probably very interested in this man, Paul, and we're going to see why in the next verse. Read that.
And it happened that the father of Publius was laying in bed affected with recurrent fever and dysentery. And Paul went in to see him, and after he had prayed, he laid hands on him and healed him.
All right, now here we see Publius's father. He's lying in bed with a recurrent fever and dysentery. Now, dysentery, of course, is an infection of the intestines, which causes diarrhea, and it's a tough thing to get over. Well, some believe this might have been cholera. I don't know what it was. Others say it might be the Malta fever. The Malta fever was a fever that could last 4 months to several years if you got it. And they did find out in 1887 that this fever was caused by a bacterium in the milk of the Maltese goats. So whatever this disease was, it was definitely very serious and could cause this man's death. All right? So Paul goes in to see him. And what does he do? He prayed and laid his hands on him. I mean, this Publius is giving him some leeway here, because he's actually touching his father. Maybe he says, I think I can do something. But he goes in, he lays his hands on him, and he's healed. This is another miracle that God is using to help these unbelievers listen to Paul. God is doing this, folks. Paul's not doing it. God is doing this so they will listen to Paul, to the person who's doing this. All right? These signs and miracles were given by God to authenticate the ministry of the apostles as God's representatives. Okay? Because here he is in a place that didn't know God at all, or didn't know our God. All right, let's go on to verse 9.
After this had happened, the rest of the people on the island who had diseases were coming to him and getting cured.
All right, these healings, along with the viper incident, gave Paul real credibility, and it opened doors for him for evangelism among all these people, which we know Paul did. But for some reason, Luke never mentions any evangelism here. He just says they came to be healed. All right? Paul would have taken every opportunity he could have had to have talked about Jesus, right? He would especially lost people, he would have definitely. And what's interesting? According to tradition, the first Gentile Christian convert on Malta was Publius. Tradition holds that he was the first Christian convert on Malta. Okay? And there are catacombs on Malta from the 4th and 5th centuries that show a lot of Christian themes. So it's interesting that Christianity was started by God through Paul on Malta that day. Well, this account of Paul healing Publius's father is and then everyone else who came to him, This really is very much like the account of Jesus. When he first started his ministry and he was healing people in Capernaum, and this was the beginning of his ministry. So it's early in Luke. So let's look at Luke 4, verses 38 through 40.
Then he got up and left the synagogue and entered Simon's home. Now Simon's mother-in-law was suffering from a high fever, and they asked him to help her. And standing over her, he rebuked the fever, and it left her. And she immediately got up and waited on them. While the sun was setting, all those who had anyone who was sick with various diseases brought them to him, and laying his hands on each one of them, he was healing them.
Yep. Now this is one of the most interesting scriptures, because this is where we find out. We only know that one of Jesus' disciples was married. We know he's married because he's there at Simon's house, and this is his mother-in-law. Okay? And what we can see in both cases, the healing of a single individual. Okay? And by the healing of this one individual, and then all the rest of the region come in to be healed as well. The individual in each case was the parent of the healer's host. Here you have Simon's mother-in-law, and what do we have? We have Publius's father. Okay, it's the parent of the host, of the healer's host, who had been taken over both had been taken over by a fever. They both laid their hands on the person, and they arose healed. Okay, so this is very similar, and then all the rest of the people from the area come around to be healed as well. So this is a very similar thing. Jesus healing in Capernaum, and Paul healing on Malta. All right, let's go to verse 10.
They also honored us with many marks of respect, and when we were setting sail, they supplied us with all we needed.
All right, these words of Luke, they honored us with many marks of respect, I think indicate that many of the people must have become believers. That's more than respect. I think that many people probably became believers, and a church very well might have been started in Malta, because it eventually was. Might have been started right then. And here, just as we saw on the ship, Paul's presence proved to be a blessing to all. God's presence in his people should always be a blessing to those who are around us. And so we should be the same. We should have the same attitude that Paul had, to be a blessing to others. All right, let's see. I think we've got enough time. All right, so now we go on to the last leg of Paul's journey to Rome in verses 11 through 16. So let's read Acts 28, verse 11.
At the end of 3 months, we set sail on an Alexandrian ship, which had wintered at the island, and which had the twin brothers on its figurehead.
All right, so here Luke is telling how they make it from Malta to Rome. They ended up spending 3 months on Malta. Okay, they're awaiting the spring weather and the good winds. They found an Alexandrian ship carrying wheat that they had to overwinter there in Malta, and they booked passage on that ship. We see that Luke now tells us that the ship had twin brothers on its masthead. Who are the twin brothers? Castor and Pollux. Okay, now who were Castor and Pollux? They what?
And they found Rome. No, that was Rome.
No, that was Romulus and Remus. Castor and Pollux were the twin half-brothers whose mother was Leda. But they had different fathers. Castor was a mortal son of Tyndareus, who was the king of Sparta, while Pollux was the divine son of Zeus, who had seduced Leda in the guise of a swan. So that
There's a star.
The twins with
There's
the different
stars.
father. Oh
That's
yeah.
why.
it's the Gemini stars. Yeah. It's the Gemini. It's a pair of stars. That's right. The pair became the guardian deities of the sailors and navigators, probably due to that's how they got the stars, right? So in a very superstitious era, you would find ships with their representations on them. And here in Scripture was one Alexandrian ship with the twin brothers' masthead. So we know they did have that. All right, let's read verse 12.
After we put in at Syracuse, we stayed there for 3 days.
And if you have your maps, you can see everywhere that they're going. You can see here they're going. They're now put in at Syracuse, and they stayed there for 3 days. Syracuse is a very important island on Sicily. Syracuse is a busy port, and it probably is the most important island on Sicily even today. But back then it was definitely one of the most important ports. Let's read verse 13.
From there we sailed around and arrived at Rhegium, and a day later a south wind sprang up, and on the second day we came to Puteoli.
Puteoli, right. All right, look, if you look on your map again, you can see that here they've come from Malta to Sicily, and they first landed in Syracuse. Now they're on the very tip of the toe, of the boot of Italy's boot in Rhegion, and this too was a very important harbor in southern Italy because it was right there on the coast, right there along the coast of Italy at the Straits of Manissa. And Manissa is that strait which separates Sicily and Italy, and there's only a 2-mile distance between Sicily and Italy. So this is a very important port right there. All right, and Luke tells us that when a south wind came, they left Rhegion and sailed up to Puteoli, which came in. It took them 2 days to get there, so they sailed up there and got there on the second day. Puteoli is a port up near the Bay of Naples. It's 180 miles north of Rhegion. It's a very large port where the Egyptian wheat ships came and were unloaded here. Now Paul and his companions and all the Roman soldiers got off the ship there, and they were going to have to travel by land, and they would travel on the Great Appian Way to Rome from here. All right, let's read verse 14.
There we found some brethren, and were invited to stay with them for 7 days, and thus we came to Rome.
Yeah, they found a group of fellow believers there and welcomed them to stay with them for 7 days. I mean, what a great opportunity to just rest, right? Well, do you think Paul rested? I figure he probably didn't rest much because Paul was always there to evangelize and teach anyone. And Luke tells us, he said, and thus we came to Rome. Well, this is actually not a travel description. It's more of a triumphant eulogy. They're not in Rome yet. They've not yet entered Rome. But Luke viewed Puteoli as close enough to warrant this enthusiastic announcement of their arrival. To arrive there signified that you were just about in Rome. You were in Greater Rome, the suburbs, I guess. But you were at the Rome's grain terminal, so you were just about there. All right, let's read verse 15.
And the brethren,
What's that? Yeah.
You know, in 14, he was still being given a great amount of freedom, considering he was a prisoner.
That's right. Oh, he was, yeah.
Considering he was invited to stay with fellow believers for 7 days.
yeah.
Isn't that amazing? Because he is a prisoner,
He is
right?
a prisoner. So,
But they stayed there for 14. They stayed there for the week because
that shows the status he had achieved.
Right.
Whoever was in charge over the course of this long voyage.
thanks for pointing that out. That's really good. That does show the importance of Paul now, doesn't it? Yeah. All right, let's read verse 15.
And the brethren, when they heard about us, came from there as far as the market of Appius and the 3 inns to meet us. And when Paul saw them, he thanked God and took courage.
Yeah, Christians came as far away from the market of Appius, which is, you see it on your map as the Forum of Appius, because that's the Forum is the market, and which is 44 miles away from Rome, and then the 3 taverns, which is 33 miles from Rome, okay, to help escort Paul into the city. I mean, can you imagine what these soldiers and what these people must have thought of Paul now and the company, all these people coming here to welcome him. They were going to escort him into the city. And like you just said, Art, Paul is still a prisoner. So he's still under the centurion's control. I mean, and who were these believers? These believers were the believers in Rome. They had just received, about 3 years earlier, a letter from Rome. What do we call it? Romans, right. They had received his letter from Corinth during his stay there, during his 3rd missionary journey. And they were the people who received the book of Romans, so the letter of Romans. And now they're going to be able to meet this famed apostle themselves. I mean, just think how thrilled they were to see him. And that's the enthusiasm I want you to think about. That's the enthusiasm these people had toward this man. And here he is, a prisoner. Okay, so I think that impresses the guards as well. All right, let's finish with verse 16.
When we entered Rome, Paul was allowed to stay by himself with a soldier who was guarding him.
Yeah, Paul, Luke, and everyone, they all finally reached Rome. We are at Rome now, okay? And Paul was allowed to stay by himself. And Art, that's the same thing. He's given amazing freedom by the guards. He's allowed to stay by himself. Now, he does have a guard there with him, but he's allowed to stay by himself and to minister to the people. They're giving him the leeway to be able to minister to those who come there. And this is pretty exceptional treatment for a prisoner. I mean, but I think that Paul had proven himself as an exceptional person to the centurion, and that's why he's giving him a lot of that leeway. He knew he could trust Paul to be ready to go before Caesar because Paul had requested, Paul had appealed to Caesar. Paul wants to see Caesar, so he's not going to run away. And I think the centurion knows his character now and knows that he can be trusted. But for all the help that Paul had been, he was given the liberty of staying by himself and ministering to those who were there. Paul's desire and God's prophecy is about to be fulfilled. And Paul was now in Rome, where he would witness for Christ. And he's going to. Any thoughts or questions?
One question I don't know if they were answered. Remember when Festus and Agrippa were trying to find something to send as a charge?
Right.
What did they do?
We don't know. We don't know what the charge. We don't know what that charge is, but they must have gotten something. Yeah. But he has a charge, so now Paul is going to be able to. And look at what God is doing through Paul and getting him to Rome. That's amazing. You know, when you think about it, all these things that God is using Paul through a storm to get to Malta. You know, he wouldn't have gone to Malta. They would have gone straight to Rome. So God caused this to happen. So it's really cool to watch, isn't it? All right, anybody else? All right, let's pray.